Hey everyone, it's Ashley Angeline Kumar, the Confidence Coach. I'm going to talk about briefly, what did I want to talk about today? I wanted to talk about the practice of being intentionally imperfect. The practice of being intentionally imperfect. Now you're like, what the heck does that mean? Okay, so if you're like me or you have a child who has perfectionist tendencies, so I call myself a recovering perfectionist, and you might be one too as a parent. When you are a perfectionist as a parent or a recovering perfectionist, parenting can definitely feel challenging because parenting is very, 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 very imperfect, right? So what is the practice of being intentionally imperfect? It's kind of how it sounds. It's being imperfect on purpose. Now, this can bring up a lot of questions for people, like, what is that? How do you do that? Like, but then doesn't that teach kids not to try their best and things like that? So what it is it's working to control the impulse to make things just right or just perfect in order for them to be good enough. What we want to practice is letting good enough be good enough. So it's different than making things perfect or working and doing things over and over again until they are just right or just perfect. Now, this is contrary to a lot of what a lot of kids' books will say, which is to keep doing something until you get it just right. I've read that in a lot of kids' books. Here's my take on it. There are times for things to do things over again until they're right, or I like to say until they're good enough. And then there's times for things to just be good enough. And so the difference is to understand in different contexts which scenario is more appropriate. I'm going to use one scenario example for you. So when I make roti is an Indian flatbread, right? So when I make that, I need to make the dough a certain way for it to actually cook properly. So that is a time for me to do it, fix it, adjust it, tweak it until it's right so that I can actually knead the dough and roll it out without it sticking to everything and cooking properly. Okay? So that's something that I need to tweak or do until it works for the cooking process. In the same scenario of cooking roti, we roll out the dough into circle shapes. Now, are my shapes always going to be circles? In fact, when kids are learning, when I started learning to make roti when I was 10, when kids are learning to make roti, it often looks like the shape of India or Africa or other places. So that is a time for me to let good enough be good enough. I don't need to pressure my child or pressure myself to make that circular shape of the roti just right in order for it to be good enough. I'm going to let good enough be good enough. So there's a little bit of a distinction to make here. I just finished a coaching session with a kid, with a child, and I created this story about Captain Ashley, who's captain of a ship, and I taught her this phrase, adjust course. Right? Adjust course. And this makes more sense in the context of the story. But basically, adjusting course is when things don't quite go the way we want it or they're imperfect, right? We make an adjustment to how we respond, not to the thing that happens because we don't necessarily control what's happening, right? But how we respond. We make an adjustment to how we respond. So when we're talking about in parenting, the intentional practice of being intentionally imperfect, it's modeling and talking about letting things be good enough. I don't always have to do or be my best. So this is like the roti example, right? There are times when I need to make the dough work for me. If it's too sticky or too dry, it won't cook properly. But then there's times to let the perfection go of making it just round enough and perfect enough. And I do know that when I was little, I remember being with groups of adults who were cooking roti or another Indian flatbread called puri. And they would complain, like, that's not round enough, or that's not, should make that one over again. And I remember that very clearly rather than letting good enough be good enough, right? So we learn, perfectionism is often a learned behavior. We see others do it, and then we pick it up as a behavior pattern as children. So what we want to do as parents, if you are trying to overcome perfectionist tendencies, is the practice of being intentionally imperfect. I'm going to use another example. When I cut fruit for my kids, since they were little, I used to peel the fruit and then cut the core of, let's say, a pear or an apple, and there was no traces of peel or the core, the inside part. Well then, hey, I set the standard high. My kids developed some sensory challenges to food over the few years, and the sensory challenges are not necessarily related to the perfectionist stuff that I was doing as a parent when I was cooking. Could be. But what I'm trying to say is I started to recognize that, what's a word to, complaining about a little piece of skin being on the apple, or a teeny bit of core, like a little bit of core being there on their apple slice. I started to notice this. And so then what I started to do was be intentionally imperfect. Like, I can see that piece of skin or that core, and there's even a seed in that one. And my instinct, my impulse is to, cut it off. Make it nice and clean and fresh, and there's no core or peel or whatever. And then I adjusted course, and I started to practice being imperfect when I sliced their fruit. So then I started to apply that to a lot of different areas of how I was parenting to support modeling how imperfection is totally okay. Totally okay. Yeah, so there's this phrase that I heard one of my mentors say, and it was, trust the lessons in the less than perfect circumstances. And when I heard her say that, I was like, that is awesome. I so need that, so that I can release some of that pressure off of myself as a parent to respond perfectly, to cut fruit perfectly, to do any parenting task perfectly, to release that pressure. And then when I'm doing that, I can show up as a model to my kids that, we can let things be good enough, and we can respect our body's energy. One day I might kill it when it comes to running or exercise or whatever. And the next day my body might be feeling a bit tired or off. And I'm going to let good enough be good enough in my workout, instead of beating myself up for not doing a certain fitness regimen that I had planned. Things don't always go according to plan, even if it's something we planned and the plan is under my control. So letting good enough be good enough. That is my Soulful Saturday practice for you. Let me know what you think. Drop me your comments.